Hello everybody, my name is Mariako, and today I'm going to show you how to utilize the particles that we have in Minecraft to improve your survival builds. This is a pretty weird topic, and one that not many people think about, so if you can integrate these into your builds, they're definitely going to look unique. So without further ado, let's get right to it. First up, we have what is likely the most common and well known of these tricks, which is that water will drip through blocks. This one is super simple to set up. You just need water above the block you want it to drip through, and then you have a nice subtle drip effect. This one works really well in a lot of situations, everything from caverns, which is particularly effective if you combine it with some mossy cobble or even lapis ore to really sell the effect, or even using it to create something like a leaky ceiling in a rundown house. Lava can also drip through, just like water does, but I've never really felt that it looked like lava finding its way through a block, so I personally don't use it too much. That being said, it does look okay in the right situation, and maybe you can find some other uses for it as well. You probably know that redstone ore also emits particles when it's activated, as well as emitting a little bit of light, which happens when you right-click on it or whenever an entity walks on top of it. These particles don't move out very far, so we can only really disguise them with some of the thinnest blocks in the game, which would be things like carpets, snow layers, pressure plates, paintings, or item frames. The easiest way to take advantage of these particles is to simply place them under some carpet or snow layers to give an interesting effect as the player or a mob walks over them, though obviously the uses for this are a little bit niche. Personally, I think the coolest way to utilize them is behind an item frame that has a custom map in it, which will give a neat, almost glowing effect to it. Obviously, making enormous pixel art textures for this is an overwhelming task that most players won't bother with, but it is really quite awesome if you have the dedication. Now, if you're the forward-thinking type, you may be wondering how the redstone ore is kept activated like this, and the secret to that is to use armor stands. These count as an entity that will activate the block, and it will do so repeatedly so that they never shut off. With a little bit of piston work, you can even create solid walls of redstone ore that will always be activated. End chests also emit particles, similar to how the redstone ore block does, but they are purple instead of red, and they also travel almost a full block away from the chest itself. This further distance means that we can see these particles through lower half slabs, as well as through the bottom corners of our builds, so we can quite often use these to help make our floors look a little bit cooler. Of course, you can also use these in the same way we did with the redstone ore. Placing them under carpets or snow layers will make the particle effect even more prominent, and putting these behind custom maps can once again look awesome. Do keep in mind that these particles unfortunately don't travel downwards from the chest, so we can't easily use this effect in our ceilings. Now, if you like the end chest particles but you want them to go through a solid wall, you do have an alternative option in portals. Nether portals emit these same particles, but they emit them 2 full blocks out, meaning you can have them emitting from your regular old walls. Obviously, all you need to do for this is build a portal behind your wall, but do keep in mind that by the time you're close enough to really see the particles, you will also hear the obnoxious portal noise, which unfortunately makes it quite a bit less useful for general building. Next up we have fire, which obviously has those nice little smoke particles coming off of it. These particles are useful for a lot of things, but they follow a specific rule that you need to keep in mind. Specifically, once these particles enter the block above the fire, the next time they hit a block, they will also stop. This means you can only have a single block directly above the fire. Any more than that, and the particles will stop traveling upwards. This also means that you can't use only upper slabs, as the space below them means the particles will hit the bottom of the slab and stop. Keeping that rule in mind, you can use these for all sorts of things. Whether that's little puffs of smoke out of a chimney, or even making some ground look like it's smoldering after a fire, which I think is pretty awesome. Of course, you do also need to keep in mind the destructive properties of fire, or you're gonna have a bad time. If you want a more subtle smoke effect, or if you just don't want to risk burning things down, you can also use torches. This works in much the same way that the fire does, including that the particles will stop as soon as they first hit a block. But due to the smaller size of torches, this will actually happen when there is only a single block directly above them. The way around this is to place the torch on the side of a block, which will raise it up just enough to send the particles into the block above it and continue upwards. This is great if you want a less dramatic smoke effect, and even using alongside fires to transition the smoke effects a little bit better. Running furnaces also have a particle effect, but this one is very subtle and pretty hard to find a use for. One thing that did come to mind for me is that if you have enough dedication to make a custom map that looks like a solid block, you could put that on the front of the furnace that's next to an extinguished fireplace or something along those lines, and it could look vaguely like some small embers and smoke still emitting from it. Obviously, this is a crazy amount of work for such a minimal detail, but I figured I'd mention it. Next up we have something a little bit less subtle, which is fireworks. Obviously, these are cool just as they are, but if you have a bit of imagination, then you can undoubtedly find a lot of fun little uses for these as particle effects in your builds. The important thing with fireworks is that, much like some of the particles we talked about earlier, they will stop going upwards as soon as they hit a block, and the particles from their explosions will also stop as soon as they hit a block in any direction. This does make concealing them into your builds a little bit tricky at times, because you need to shoot them directly into the block that you want them to emit from, and you need a block on top of that to prevent the fireworks from going through. But the effect can still be pretty cool, and it's well worth the hassle. In their most basic form, you can use them to have a nice glittery or snow-looking effect raining down from your ceiling. But with a little bit of imagination, you could even use them for something like making some toxic stuff spew out of a pipe, or making a mechanical-looking build look like it's emitting sparks. Of course, you'll have the audio from the fireworks happening as well, which is a little bit unfortunate, but I still think they're pretty cool to use. Continuing with the explosive theme, next up we have the explosions from TNT. Unfortunately, it is pretty tricky to take full advantage of this one, between its destructive nature and the fact that the smoke-like particles from it don't really travel through blocks or happen at all when the TNT is exploded in water. However, if you do detonate it in water, then you can pretty easily take advantage of the large swirly-looking particles that spawn from it. These swirly particles travel a little over 2 blocks out, meaning that they are easily disguised. Admittedly, they are only really useful in extremely niche circumstances, but something like making a TNT blast door down in a mine, or even something like a rocket launch pad can look pretty epic by taking advantage of them. Now, this one I'll be impressed if you already knew, because I certainly didn't before working on this tutorial. If you're like me, you were always told, and had naturally assumed, that the particles that go towards your enchanting table from the bookshelves indicate that the bookshelves are powering the enchanting table and increasing its levels. This isn't actually true. It turns out that the particles are only actually checking if the block directly next to the enchanting table on their side is clear, and then sending the particles even if there's technically something blocking their path and they aren't adding any levels to the table. This is even true for the bookshelves on the upper layer, meaning that there are some circumstances in which we can completely hide an enchanting table and just have the little galactic alphabet characters floating around. Naturally, there are some pretty strict limitations on what you can do with this, but it's something really cool to keep in mind for any enchanted feeling areas. Narrow passageways lined with bookshelves or just blocks that you want to feel magical are good candidates for this. If you're particularly dedicated and once again want to make a giant pixel art for a custom map, you can even do some really cool magical looking pillars that have these runic looking particles floating around them. I should also mention that item frames are a special block due to not having a hitbox, so even for regular enchanting setups you can cover your bookshelves or enchanting table with them and they'll still work just fine. Next we have note blocks, which are cool but quite limited. Unfortunately, note blocks will only play if they have an air block directly above them, so you can't disguise them using slabs or even carpets. They're a decent enough looking block to use them in your builds directly, but if you want to take advantage of the particles by themselves, then you're limited to setting them up in a very enclosed area with very limited visibility. The next one is another one that's kind of tricky to use, which is bubbles. You get these when you have various entities travel through water. Obviously, this has some pretty niche uses, but if you want an interesting water feature in your build, well, it's a solid choice. I've found that either arrows or snowballs work pretty well for this, with arrows working a little bit better in general, though do keep in mind that any arrows you fire will take a full minute to despawn, so if you're going to be going for a lot of bubbles, you may want to use snowballs instead. Also keep in mind that it takes a few blocks for the arrows or snowballs to lose their momentum, so you'll probably want to send them through a few blocks of water before they reach the main part. Though you can minimize this with arrows at least using pistons. Also, if you're feeling particularly ambitious, the beams that the Guardians shoot also emit some bubbles, so you can use these for some pretty crazy effects as well. Next up we have the lingering potions we got in 1.9. If you're not familiar with them yet, these leave a pool of swirling potion particles on the ground wherever they land. These particles don't last very long and will be noticeably shrinking in less than 10 seconds, so this is mostly good for short, quick things that you want to happen around your builds. Do keep in mind that these particles completely ignore both collision and physics, so you can easily hide your dispensers to launch them out, as well as make them float up in the sky if you want to. Of course, the actual uses for these are pretty limited, but if you need something like some radioactive ooze, or you just want to add a little bit of life to something like a waterfall, then these are pretty useful. Following the potion-like theme, we have the bottles of enchanting, or rather the experience orb particles that you get from them. These are unreasonably expensive for the amount of XP they give you, so realistically this isn't practical for much in survival, but if you're really loaded on emeralds and you want to give yourself an XP shower, then go right ahead. This is another subtle one, the little puff of smoke you get from dispensers or droppers. The secret to taking advantage of this one is to dispense bone meal from a dispenser. This will give you a little puff of smoke, but unless the bone meal is actually used to grow something, it won't waste any of it. Making use of this one, like many things in this guide, can be a little bit tricky. I find it's mostly useful for giving life to some more advanced looking mechanical builds, such as creating things like engines or generators. Or it can even make for some pretty cool looking exhaust systems out the back of slightly bigger builds. Unfortunately, the particles can't really be shot downwards, and even when pointing up, they're a lot less prominent than they were when they're facing horizontally, so do keep that in mind. Also, if you're trying to shoot them upwards, keep in mind that, because they're spawning from the middle of the dispenser, any blocks on top of it will stop the particles. The remaining particles that we can use in survival all have very limited uses, so we're just going to cover them very quickly. Mycelium has a very subtle particle effect, so subtle in fact, and it travels such a short distance from the block that it's hard to utilize in a build. The one thing that comes to mind for me is to use it to simulate little bugs in a carpet in a rundown house build, but maybe you can think of something else. One really cool particle effect is the one you get when sheep eat grass. The particles actually travel through the dirt block, and it can almost look like the dirt block is crumbling and about to cave in. Unfortunately, because this effect only happens when the sheep eat grass, it's extremely hard to control it, and there's no real way to use it reliably in vanilla. You could still try and use it in your caves, but having the sheep noise is pretty distracting to the illusion. There are several other particle effects in the game that we just can't really use. Things like particles on end rods, which just stick a little bit too close to the block itself to be of any use on their own, the particles that bounce out of lava because they can't really pass through anything, the heart-shaped particles from breeding, etc. There are a couple duplicate sources for particle effects, things like end crystals having explosions like TNT, or brewing stands emitting smoke like torches, but because we have much easier to use alternatives, we can just ignore those. So, I'd say that's a pretty comprehensive look on utilizing particles to give your builds that little bit of extra flair. Hopefully this has given you some inspiration to take advantage of these things yourself, and I would love to hear what ways you can come up with to use these particles in builds of your own. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.